Welcome to the Banega Swasth India podcast. Our focus is on creating a holistic and healthy India for each and every one. Our goal is one world hygiene where citizens, individuals, society and governments work together to ensure health for all and foster global unity for a healthier tomorrow. I'm Ambika Singh Kama. Today we have with us a very special guest, Avantika Goswami, Program Manager, Climate Change, Center for Science and Environment, to discuss all about COP28 key announcements and India's stand. The COP28 climate meeting that happened in the UAE delivered some of the most important outcomes, like for the first time, there has been the acknowledgement of the need to move away from fossil fuels and a first promise to reduce methane emissions. Avantika, thank you so much for joining us. If you can explain a bit about COP28 and what were some of the key announcements made?
COP28 this year was held in Dubai in the UAE, and it was a very crucial year because a series of IPCC reports have been recently released which suggest that we need to cut global greenhouse gas emissions by 43% by 2030 if we are to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So it was very important that this climate summit really furthers issues of climate ambition, financing, climate justice, and the COP summit itself happened at a very difficult time. The world is quite polarized. There are two global wars going on, and extreme weather events have also been growing. And many countries, particularly poor and developing countries, have been feeling the impacts of the climate crisis. So this is the context in which COP28 had occurred. And this summit has achieved some very interesting outcomes. So the outcomes are really a mixed bag, some positive, some not so positive. So I'll start with some of the big achievements. So for the first time in 30 years of climate negotiations, the word fossil fuels has been written in the decision text of a COP summit. And this sounds, it's almost hilarious that, for so many years, scientists have been talking about how burning of fossil fuels is leading to excess emissions of greenhouse gases and making global warming worse. But COP summits are a political place where almost 200 countries of the world have to come together and agree on every word that is put in the final decision document. So this was the first COP, which was hosted in an oil and gas producing country. There have been COPs in oil and gas producing countries before, but this was a COP that was hosted in an oil and gas producing country that managed to achieve the inclusion of the word fossil fuels in the decision text. So this was quite a big achievement in our opinion. The final document of the global stocktake talks about the need to transition away from fossil fuels and move towards net zero energy systems. So this was definitely a big milestone at the end of this COP summit. Another big achievement was the operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund. So last year at COP27, in a huge win for developing countries, a fund was agreed upon, which will be filled with hopefully grant-based money that will then be disbursed to poor and vulnerable countries who are suffering irreversible damages as a result of climate-linked extreme weather events. And last year, the fund was announced. Over the past 1 year, there have been a lot of tense discussions about who will pay into the fund, who will receive money from the fund, where will the fund be located. On the first day of COP28, the presidency of this COP, the UAE, managed to achieve activation of this fund. And there were also commitments of different pledges from different countries amounting to close to $700 million towards this fund. Now, it's important to remember that $700 million is not a lot of money in the context of the growing need for global losses and damages. And developed countries are spending far more money in their domestic budgets. But it's definitely a start, and it really set the tone for the rest of the COP. So these are two big outcomes, and I'm happy to go into further detail based on other questions.
Talking about the impact, Avantika, if you can highlight how COP28 impacted the lives and livelihoods on the ground.
So COP summits, they seem like they're a very far away, high level process. There's a, it seems almost like there's a community of climate activists, scientists, academics who go every year for COP. And it seems quite distanced from everyday lives of people. But the fact is that COP is one space globally where 200 countries of the world come together to discuss how to tackle climate change, and each country has an equal voice. So depending on whichever country you are from, your country is present most likely at the COP summit and is advocating for certain solutions or advocating for certain language. It's advocating for certain ideas. And the ideas that get pushed at COP summits, they act as global signals. Whatever decision document or outcome document that the COP summit produces, it's a signal to the entire world in terms of where we are moving ahead on climate policy. It's a signal to investors and businesses about what types of technologies are going to be growing. It's a signal to governments in terms of what types of domestic climate policies they should be making. And all of these signals to large entities around the world eventually affect individuals, right down to you and me and others around us.
Banega Swasth India podcast will be back after a short break.
Watch out for our new Banega Swasth India video podcast, Swasthya Mantra, the first ever public health and hygiene podcast. The podcast is live on Spotify, Apple, and YouTube in English and in Hindi.
Welcome back to Banega Swasth India podcast. Prime Minister Narendra Modi during the COP28 summit called on all nations to work together to cut global emissions drastically and announced a green credit initiative that focuses on creating carbon skins with people's participation. If you can highlight a bit about India's position at COP28.
In terms of India's position, so India at COP is engaging in the capacity of a developing country, but the context is very important. So India has contributed only 3% to historical carbon dioxide emissions. This means emissions of carbon dioxide emitted between 1870 to about 2019. For all the carbon dioxide emitted by all countries of the world in this period, India's share is only 3%. Today, on an annual basis, India is still contributing only 7% of global annual carbon dioxide emissions. So we are a small contributor to the climate change problem, both historically as well as today, particularly when you think about the fact that we are today the most populous country. So our per capita emissions are far below the world average. Despite this, India has an NDC in place, which is the climate pledge that's made to the Paris Agreement. The NDC has 3 parts, and India is on track to actually meet at least 2 out of 3 of the targets it has pledged to the Paris Agreement. So at COP summits, India definitely reminds developed countries that they have a responsibility to take the lead on climate action. They should be taking more rapid and urgent action to phase out fossil fuels. India is a big advocate for the concept of equity and CBDR, where developed countries should take the lead in climate action and transfer resources to developing countries to help them to decarbonize. India has also been quite reticent to take on any new targets or any new pledges beyond what it has committed in its NDC. This is because, in line with the principle of historical responsibility, the larger burden should be on developed countries.
Lastly, I would like to ask you, is India on track to meet its climate change targets?
India has committed a 3-part target to the Paris Agreement under its NDC. The first is to have a 45% reduction of emissions intensity of its GDP by 2030. The second is to have 50% non-fossil installed power capacity by 2030. And the third is to increase its carbon sink by 2.5 to 3 gigatons through additional forest and tree cover. So India recently published at COP28 itself, it published its national greenhouse gas inventory of 2019. And this was submitted in the National Communication or NATCOM document to the UNFCCC. And under this, the Ministry of Environment has announced that India is actually on track to, India has already reduced emissions intensity of its GDP by 33% between 2005 and 2019. And its target is to reduce it by 45% by 2030. So it looks like we are on track to achieving this target. In terms of its non-fossil installed power capacity, currently India has 41% share of clean power in terms of capacity, according to this document. The CEA, or the Central Electricity Authority, actually projects that by 2030, India will overachieve and will have something like 62% of non-fossil installed power capacity, 64% if you count nuclear power as well. So it's likely that we will overachieve on this target as well. So definitely on 2 out of 3 targets, India is on track to meet its NDC. And this is a very positive sign.
Well, that's it on the Banega Swasth India podcast this week. If you have comments, queries, or suggestions on the topic we discussed today, or issues you would like us to cover in future, do write to us on bsipodcast@ndtv.com. Remember, BSI stands for Banega Swasth India. You can also connect with us on Banega Swasth India handles on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and continue with this conversation through the week. Till next week, this is Ambika Singh Kama signing off. Stay healthy and stay safe.